An American lieutenant peers into a rail car. The smell hits first. Sweet, rotting, overwhelming. He sees bodies stacked like cordwood. Thousands of them. Men, women, skeletal remains in striped uniforms. Some have bite marks. The living had tried to eat the dead. He steps back, vomits, wipes his mouth. Behind him, his platoon is gathering, rifles tightening in hands, faces hardening. The sadness is already turning to something else. Cold, shaking rage. A quarter-mile away, SS guards stand in their towers, clean uniforms, well-fed, waiting to surrender. They expect to be treated like prisoners of war. They're wrong. This is the story of what happened when American soldiers, farm boys, factory workers, liberators, walked into the worst place human beings had ever created. By the end, you'll understand three things. 1. What the soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division actually saw when they reached Dachau, and why it shattered every assumption they had about war. 2. What happened in the minutes and hours after liberation, the executions, the beatings, the moment discipline collapsed and vengeance took over. 3. Why General George Patton burned the investigation, and what that decision reveals about justice, morality, and the limits of military law. The stakes. 50 SS guards lined against a wall, American soldiers with their fingers on triggers, and a choice that would haunt both sides for the rest of their lives. The men of the 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds, were not novices. They'd fought in Sicily, Italy, southern France. They'd seen friends die. They'd killed German soldiers in combat. They understood war's brutality in ways civilians never would. But on the morning of April 29, 1945, they had no idea they were walking towards something worse than any battlefield. They were pushing toward a large complex near Munich. Intelligence suggested a military installation, maybe a supply depot, maybe a factory. The war was ending. Resistance was sporadic. This was supposed to be routine. Then they reached the railroad siding. 39 cattle cars sat silent on the tracks. No movement, no sound, just the smell. Private First Class John Lee, 19 years old, from Oklahoma, approached one of the cars. The door was partially open. He looked inside. What he saw would stay with him for 50 years. Bodies, hundreds of them in this car alone. Emaciated beyond recognition, limbs like sticks, skin stretched over bone, eyes open, staring at nothing. They'd been locked inside and left to die. No food, no water. Days of suffering compressed into a single freight car. Lee stepped back, sat down in the dirt, started crying. Other soldiers moved down the line of cars, opening doors. Each one revealed the same horror. By the time they'd checked every car, the count was staggering. 2,300 bodies. Some showed signs of cannibalism, bite marks on limbs, the final desperation of people who'd been reduced to animals. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, commanding the battalion's lead elements, tried to maintain order. "Keep moving," he shouted. "Don't stop. Keep moving toward the objective." But you can't unsee what they'd just seen. You can't compartmentalize that level of suffering and continue operating as a professional soldier. The rage was immediate, visceral, uncontrollable. These were American soldiers trained to follow the Geneva Conventions, trained to take prisoners, trained to treat enemy combatants according to international law. But the death train wasn't a military target. It was evidence of something the soldiers didn't have vocabulary for yet. The word Holocaust wasn't in common use. Genocide was barely known. They were looking at industrial murder, systematic, bureaucratic, evil at a scale that made combat seem clean by comparison. And ahead of them, visible through the morning haze, stood the camp itself. Watchtowers, barbed wire, SS guards in crisp uniforms, the men responsible. The soldiers tightened their grips on their M1 Garands and Thompson submachine guns. Some checked their ammunition. Others just stared at the camp with expressions that had gone cold and empty. Sparks saw what was building. He'd been an officer long enough to recognize when discipline was about to break. He tried to reassert control, orders, structure, military procedure. But the death train had already changed the equation. The Dachau concentration camp had been operating since 1933. 12 years of torture, medical experiments, executions, and starvation. Over 200,000 people had been imprisoned there. More than 40,000 had died. By April 1945, it held approximately 30,000 survivors, if that word even applies to people reduced to living skeletons. The camp commandant, Martin Weiss, had fled days earlier, but he'd left behind a young SS lieutenant named Heinrich Wicker and roughly 500 SS personnel to manage the handover. Wicker believed in procedure. He believed the Americans would follow protocol. He put on his dress uniform, polished his boots, and prepared to formally surrender the facility. He walked toward the American lines carrying a white flag. He expected to be treated as a military officer, a salute, perhaps even a handshake. An American captain met him at the gate, listened to Wicker's formal surrender speech, looked at the well-fed German in his clean uniform, then looked past him at the camp, at the emaciated prisoners staring through barbed wire, at the smoke still rising from the crematorium. The captain spat in Wicker's face, shoved him aside, ordered his men forward. The surrender had been rejected. What came next wasn't a military operation. It was something else entirely. As American forces entered the camp perimeter, two parallel realities unfolded. On one side, liberation. 30,000 prisoners, those who could still move, rushed toward the fences, screaming with joy, crying, reaching skeletal hands through barbed wire toward the American soldiers. Americans! Americans! Some tried to kiss the soldiers' boots. Others simply collapsed in relief, their bodies too weak to sustain the emotion. But while prisoners celebrated, the soldiers were hunting. Near a coal yard on the camp's western edge, a group of SS guards attempted to surrender. Approximately 50 men, hands raised, shouting the phrase they believed would save them. Hitler kaputt, Hitler is finished. They thought the magic words would invoke Geneva Convention protections. Prisoner of war status, safety. They were wrong. Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead, a Cherokee officer from Oklahoma, was commanding the unit that encountered them. He'd just come from the crematorium. He'd seen the ovens still full of ash. He'd seen the gas chamber disguised as a shower room. He looked at the SS guards, healthy, clean, arrogant even in surrender. He looked at his men, saw the same cold fury he felt. He didn't give a verbal order. He gestured with his Thompson submachine gun. A simple motion. Line them up. The Germans were confused at first. Then they understood. Panic spread. "Geneva Convention!" one shouted. "Prisoners of war! You must—" The words died as they were pushed against a brick wall. 50 men in a line, some still trying to protest. Others silent, understanding what was about to happen. A machine gunner, identified in some accounts only as Bird Eye, set up his .30 caliber M1919 on a tripod. The metallic click of the gun locking into position echoed across the yard. He looked at Lieutenant Bushyhead, waiting for confirmation. Bushyhead nodded. The machine gun opened fire. The sustained burst lasted approximately 10 seconds. Tracer rounds stitched across the brick wall. Bodies jerked and fell. Screams cut short. When the firing stopped, 50 SS guards lay in the coal dust. Most were dead. Some were twitching, mortally wounded. Blood mixed with black coal dust turned the ground into a dark, viscous mud. The American soldiers stood silent. Some were breathing hard. Others looked blank, almost dissociated. One was crying, not from remorse, but from the release of rage that had been building since the death train. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks heard the gunfire from deeper in the camp. He came running, expecting a firefight with SS holdouts. Instead, he found his men standing over a pile of executed prisoners. Sparks drew his pistol and fired into the air. "Stop! What the hell are you doing? Cease fire!" The soldiers turned to look at him. No defiance, no shame, just emptiness. The machine gunner, still gripping his weapon, spoke first. "Colonel, they deserved it." Sparks looked at the bodies, looked at his men. He understood what had happened. He understood why. But he also understood that what had just occurred was a war crime under international law. He ordered his men to secure the area, lock down the remaining SS personnel. No more executions. But the killing wasn't over. It was happening everywhere. At Watchtower B, SS guards attempted to surrender by climbing down from their posts, hands raised, shouting in broken English. American soldiers shot them off the ladders. Bodies fell into the moat surrounding the tower. Soldiers then walked to the edge and emptied their rifle magazines into the water, making sure. At the camp's eastern perimeter, prisoners had somehow broken out of their barracks. Skeletal men who could barely walk were hunting SS guards. They found one hiding in a storage shed, dragged him out. They didn't have weapons. They had shovels, sticks, their bare hands. American soldiers stood nearby, watching, smoking cigarettes. "Should we stop them?" one private asked his sergeant. "No," the sergeant replied. "Let them finish." The beating took several minutes. The guard screamed, begged. The prisoners didn't stop until he was unrecognizable. In another section, prisoners identified a capo, a prisoner who'd collaborated with the SS, who'd beaten other inmates to earn better treatment. They drowned him in a latrine pit. For approximately 1 hour, Dachau existed in a lawless space. The victims became judges, juries, and executioners. The US Army stood by and watched. Eventually, Sparks restored control. He locked the surviving SS personnel in secure areas, as much to protect them from his own men as to prevent escape. But the damage was done. Photographs had been taken. Witnesses had seen everything. And the United States Army now had a problem. Within days, rumors reached higher command. Reports of mass executions. American soldiers killing surrendered enemy personnel. On May 3, 1945, 4 days after liberation, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker arrived at Dachau with an investigative team. His orders were clear: determine what happened, collect evidence, prepare a report. Whitaker interviewed soldiers, examined the coal yard where 50 SS guards had been executed, collected photographs showing American troops standing over German bodies, documented testimony from witnesses, both American and German. The evidence was overwhelming. US soldiers had violated the Geneva Conventions. They had executed prisoners of war. Whitaker's report was titled Investigation of Alleged Mistreatment of German Guards at Dachau. The conclusions were damning. American troops had committed war crimes. Officers had failed to maintain discipline. Soldiers had acted outside the bounds of international law. The report recommended courts-martial for multiple personnel, including Lieutenant Bushyhead and others who'd participated in or failed to prevent the executions. The document worked its way up the chain of command, through division, through corps, through theater headquarters. It landed on General George S. Patton's desk. Patton was a complicated man, a disciplinarian who'd once slapped a soldier for showing symptoms of combat fatigue, a stickler for regulations who demanded polished boots and proper salutes. But he was also a pragmatist who understood what his men had encountered at Dachau. He read Whitaker's report, looked at the photographs of executed SS guards, then looked at the photographs of the death train, the crematorium, the starved prisoners. He called Whitaker to his office. "What is this garbage?" Patton asked, holding up the report. "Sir, it's evidence of war crimes committed by US personnel." Patton threw the report onto his desk. "War crimes? You walk into a place like that, you see 2,000 dead bodies on a train, and you expect my boys to follow the rulebook?" The conversation, as later recalled by witnesses, continued. "These men were overwrought. They had nervous trigger fingers. It happens in combat." Patton made a decision. He would not sign court-martial papers. He would not prosecute American soldiers for killing SS guards at Dachau. According to some accounts, he took Whitaker's report and burned it in a trash can. According to others, He ordered it buried in the deepest classified archive, never to be opened. What's certain is that he told his staff, "There will be no trials. The SS got what they deserved." The investigation was quashed. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, was informed of the situation. He reviewed the evidence, saw the photographs of both the atrocities and the reprisals. He made a calculation. Putting American liberators on trial for killing Nazi concentration camp guards would destroy morale across the entire European theatre. It would send a message that the US military valued procedural correctness over moral justice. The order came down from Chef headquarters. Close the investigation. No charges. Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead returned to Oklahoma after the war. He never spoke publicly about Dachau. He died in 1977, taking the details of what happened in that coal yard to his grave. The .30 caliber machine gunner known as Bird Eye was never publicly identified. His name remains unknown. Felix Sparks, who'd tried to stop the killing, continued his military career. He later became a brigadier general in the Colorado National Guard. In interviews decades later, he acknowledged what happened but offered no apologies. "I understand why they did it," he said. "I tried to stop it because it was illegal, but I understood." The soldiers who participated carried the memory differently. Some felt guilt, others felt nothing. Many simply refused to discuss it. One veteran, interviewed in the 1980s, said, "I know killing prisoners is wrong, but that day, in that place, it felt like the only right thing to do. I've never regretted it." Another said, "They weren't human to me anymore. After what I saw on that train, those SS guards were just things, evil things that needed to be destroyed." The Dachau reprisals remain controversial. From a legal standpoint, what happened was clear. American soldiers executed prisoners of war in violation of the Geneva Conventions. Under international law, it was a war crime. But law and morality don't always align. The SS guards at Dachau were not conventional soldiers. They were active participants in mass murder. They'd operated gas chambers. They'd starved prisoners. They'd conducted medical experiments on living human beings. The Geneva Conventions were written to protect soldiers, combatants who'd surrendered. They weren't written to protect concentration camp personnel who'd committed crimes against humanity. Modern historians who study Dachau generally avoid simple judgments. They note that what happened was understandable without being justifiable. That soldiers subjected to extreme trauma react in extreme ways. That there's a difference between a calculated massacre and a spontaneous breakdown of discipline driven by moral shock. They also note the context. By April 1945, American soldiers had been fighting for years. They'd seen unimaginable violence, but they'd never encountered anything like Dachau, industrial murder on a scale that defied comprehension. One historian described it as the moment when the abstraction of Nazi evil became concrete. The soldiers who pulled the triggers weren't psychopaths. They were ordinary men confronted with extraordinary evil. The question isn't whether what they did was legal. It wasn't. The question is whether, in that moment, legality mattered. If you'd been there, if you'd walked past 2,300 corpses stacked in rail cars, if you'd seen the ovens still full of ash, if you'd watched skeletal prisoners weep with joy at being rescued from a mechanized hell, and then you'd seen the guards who'd run that hell, standing clean and healthy, expecting to be treated with military courtesy, would you have followed procedure? Would you have processed them as prisoners of war? Or would you have done what those soldiers did? There's no correct answer. There's only the truth of what happened. Approximately 50 SS guards were executed by American forces at Dachau on April 29, 1945. The exact number varies in different accounts. Some sources say as few as 30, others as many as 70. The chaos and incomplete records make precision impossible. What's certain is that American soldiers killed surrendered enemy personnel, and that their commanding officers, up to the level of Army Command, chose not to punish them for it. Patton's decision to burn the investigation wasn't mercy. It was a judgment call about which crime was worse. killing concentration camp guards, or holding soldiers accountable for a human reaction to inhuman circumstances. He chose to protect his men. The Dachau liberation and its aftermath received immediate media attention, but not for the reprisals. Journalists embedded with US forces documented the camp's horrors. Photographs of emaciated prisoners, of the crematorium ovens, of the death train. These images shocked the world and provided undeniable evidence of Nazi atrocities. But the executions of SS guards were quietly buried. Some photographs existed, but they weren't published. The soldiers involved didn't speak publicly. The official reports mentioned unfortunate incidents without details. It wasn't until the 1980s, when veterans began giving interviews for oral history projects, that the full story emerged. What complicates the narrative further is that not all SS personnel at Dachau were executed. Hundreds surrendered and were processed as prisoners of war. They were eventually tried for war crimes. Many were convicted and executed through legal proceedings. The difference: timing and location. The guards who surrendered to different units, or who were captured after the initial shock had passed, survived to face judicial punishment. The guards in the coal yard were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, encountering soldiers whose capacity for procedural restraint had been shattered by what they'd just witnessed. Heinrich Wicker, the SS lieutenant who'd attempted the formal surrender, survived. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted. He was released in 1954 and died in 1999. In interviews, he maintained that the American soldiers at Dachau had acted improperly, that he'd attempted an honorable surrender and been met with violence. He never expressed remorse for his role in running the camp. The capos and collaborators who were beaten to death by prisoners are harder to document. Camp records don't specify how many died in the immediate aftermath of liberation. The chaos of that day erased precise accounting. Felix Sparks, who'd tried to stop the coal yard execution, later reflected on the impossible position he'd been in. "I was trying to maintain military discipline in a situation where discipline had become meaningless. These men had just seen hell on earth. How do you order them to follow regulations after that?" He never criticized his men. He acknowledged their actions were illegal, but refused to condemn them as immoral. "War crimes are complicated," he said in a 1989 interview. What happened at Dachau, both the camp itself and the reprisals, shows that sometimes the law can't account for reality. Today, the Dachau concentration camp is a memorial and museum. More than 800,000 people visit each year. The exhibits document the camp's history, the systematic murder, the medical experiments, the liberation by American forces. There is no exhibit about the reprisals, no memorial to the SS guards killed in the coal yard. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves. Their names are rarely mentioned. History has rendered its judgment. They were the architects of industrialized murder. What happened to them on April 29th was illegal. But it was also, in a certain moral sense, inevitable. When you create hell, you shouldn't expect mercy from those who discover it. The Dachau reprisals raise questions that extend beyond one day in 1945, about the limits of military law in the face of genocide, about the line between justice and vengeance, about what happens when soldiers trained for conventional combat encounter evil beyond their training scope. The US military learned from Dachau, not just about concentration camps, but about the psychological impact of liberating them. When American forces discovered additional camps, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, commanders made different decisions. They brought in military police earlier. They established stricter control protocols. They tried to prevent the spontaneous breakdown of discipline that had occurred at Dachau. But they also understood something Patton had understood: that expecting soldiers to maintain professional detachment in the face of industrialized murder was asking something inhuman of human beings. The Dachau reprisals weren't unique. Similar incidents occurred at other camps. They were just less well documented, more successfully suppressed. What makes Dachau significant is that we have records, testimony, photographs, a paper trail that leads to Patton's desk and his decision to protect his men. That decision, to choose soldiers over procedure, mercy over law, reflects a moral calculus that warfare constantly demands but rarely makes explicit. The soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division carried Dachau with them for the rest of their lives. Not guilt, most felt none, but the weight of having seen and done things that separated them from everyone who hadn't been there. They'd liberated 30,000 prisoners. They'd provided food, medical care, hope. They'd avenged the murdered and stopped future atrocities. They'd also killed surrendered prisoners in cold blood. Both things are true, and neither cancels the other out. This is one chapter in the long history of how ordinary people respond when confronted with extraordinary evil, and what that reveals about justice, law, and the limits of both. If this story matters to you, your engagement helps preserve these difficult histories. Thanks for watching.